tell
All right.
you're seated. So.
2 minutes. The nominations are now in order. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
Mr. Speaker Pro Temp, Madam Clerk, colleagues, on behalf of the House Republican Conference, I rise today to nominate the gentleman from Louisiana, Mike Johnson, as Speaker of the People's House. We convene this esteemed body today at a time of great crisis across America, a time of unprecedented challenges in this hallowed chamber, and a time when our most precious ally, Israel's very existence, is under attack from forces of evil. Yesterday, our dear colleague, our former conference chair, our chair of Energy and Commerce, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, nominated Mike Johnson in our conference. And she put it best, and I want to quote her today. She said, quote, "Trust has been broken, and we have come to a standstill. How do we restore trust between members, leadership, and ultimately between Congress and we, the people?" Cathy went on to say, "There's a sense that it cannot be business as usual." She went on to note, above the Speaker's chair in the House chamber is our nation's motto, "In God we trust." Ms. McMorris Rodgers went on to say, "The times in which we are living demand boldness, unity, and transformational leadership that begins with trust in God and each other. Trust is when the magic happens." In the story of King David, we are reminded that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart, end quote. Today is the day that House Republicans will humbly look in our hearts and elect Mike Johnson as Speaker of the People's House. A man of deep faith, Mike epitomizes what it means to be a servant leader. A deeply respected constitutional lawyer, Mike has dedicated his life to preserving America's great principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mike is a titan on the Judiciary Committee and a dedicated member of the House Armed Services Committee. And as vice chair of our conference, he has united all of our members to speak clearly and boldly on behalf of the American people. A friend to all and an enemy to none, Mike is strong, tough, and fair, and above all, Mike is kind. And at this very moment, this Republican conference knows that we live in perilous times and the American people are hurting. Families are struggling under the pain of inflation caused by reckless far-left spending, unable to afford groceries, heat, or gas. We have an inhumane open border with millions illegally smuggled and trafficked, and tens of thousands of children lost in the chasm of the incompetence and negligence of the Biden administration. Israel is under attack by Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists committing atrocities, with Israelis suffering the bloodiest days in modern memory. Crime is skyrocketing on our streets, while there are vicious calls from the left to defund our great men and women in blue. American energy production has been crushed by Joe Biden's radical, failed, far-left Democrat policies, causing seniors, farmers, and families to pay more at the pump. And Americans fundamentally understand that the federal government has been illegally weaponized against we, the people, shredding the Constitution, targeting conservatives, parents, yes, I'll say it again. The federal government has been illegally weaponized against we, the people, shredding the Constitution, targeting conservatives, parents, and even Joe Biden's top political opponent. The people are looking to this great chamber to save America, and save America we will. And as we embark on the path ahead, I am reminded of Galatians 6:9. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. House Republicans and Speaker Mike Johnson will never give up. Today is the day we get this done. May God bless our next Speaker, Mike Johnson. May God bless the United States of America. And I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker pro tempore. I notice a little bit more of a smile on your face today than we have in the past. Mr. Speaker, I rise today at the direction of the Democratic caucus to place into nomination for the position of Speaker of the House of Representatives the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries from New York. Mr. Speaker, you may agree with this, but we are back here 22 days into this Republican-manufactured chaos, and House Republicans have brought us to the exact same position that we were back then. All of the infighting, all of the disarray, just to end up where we were 3 weeks ago. These past few weeks, we have been left wondering if Republicans were truly intent on solving our issues, reopening the House of Representatives, and rallying around someone to lead this chamber. Or has this been about something else? Has this been about a focus of House Republicans to find the person who can pass their extreme litmus test to oppose marriage equality, enact a nationwide abortion ban, without exceptions, gut Social Security and Medicare, and support overturning a free and fair election? It's a fair question. It's a fair question. No one. Nowhere in that candidate questionnaire is it about growing the middle class, helping our communities, keeping the cost of health care lower, and making life for everyday Americans better. The gentlewoman from New York said it right. This has been about one thing. This has been about who can appease Donald Trump. House Republicans have put their names behind someone who has been called the most important architect of the Electoral College objections. He's spearheaded, that's fair, we know how you feel. Yeah, you've made that clear. He's spearheaded the legal effort, joined by more than 100 of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in support of a dangerous and baseless lawsuit to overturn the results of the 2020 election. On the eve of January 6th, some of my Republican colleagues even called this a failed strategy. Yet those same individuals plan to stand right next to him today. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, House Democrats believe that when members of this body voted to reject the results of the 2020 election, they forfeited their ability to lead this chamber. On this side of the aisle, we know what leadership looks like. Hakeem Jeffries has never turned his back on the will of the American people. The son of two social workers, he has always stood by the side of working families. The most pressing needs of everyday Americans are his North Star. He believes that everyone in America should have the opportunity to get ahead and achieve their version of the American dream. He believes that access to affordable health care is a right, not a privilege. He believes that reproductive freedom must be guaranteed, not stripped away. He believes that working families, not the wealthy and the well-connected, should be rewarded. He believes in growing the middle class so that everyone can succeed. He believes that our schools and our communities should be safe and free from gun violence. He believes that investing in public schools, not depriving students of fact-based education by banning books. He believes in taking care of our seniors and our veterans, not slashing their benefits. He believes in living up to the promise that America is a beacon of hope and a land of opportunity. He believes in defending democracy against all enemies and adversaries, foreign and domestic. He believes in standing by our allies, Israel and Ukraine. And he believes in keeping our government running and open. Let me be clear. This is not just a belief system. Leader Jeffries has the track record to back it up. He is certainly a far contrast from who Republicans have nominated, with or without their votes, to nominate today. But if House Republicans choose, they can still join us on a bipartisan path forward. Let's come together to fund our government, support our allies abroad, and deliver for working families. End the chaos and the dysfunction, end the extremism. Let's open up the people's house. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The reading clerk will now call the roll.
Adams. Jeffries. Adderholt. Johnson. Aguilar. Jeffries. Alford.
Servant Leader, Honorable Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Allen.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Allred. Jeffries. Amadei.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Armstrong. Johnson. Arrington. Johnson. Auchincloss. Jeffries. Babin.
Johnson of Louisiana.
Johnson. Bacon.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Baird.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Balderson. Johnson. Ballant. Jeffries. Banks.
Mike
Johnson.
Johnson.
Barr.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Berrigan. Jeffries. Bean of Florida.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Beatty. Jeffries. Bentz. Johnson. Barra. Jeffries. Bergman. Johnson. Beyer. Beyer. Bice. Johnson. Biggs. Johnson. Bilirakis.
Absolutely, Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Bishop of Georgia.
Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Bishop of North Carolina.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Blumenauer. Jeffries. Blunt Rochester. Jeffries. Boebert. Johnson. Bonamici. Jeffries. Bost. Johnson. Bowman. Jeffries. Boyle of Pennsylvania. Boyle of Pennsylvania. Burkeen. Johnson. Brown. Jeffries. Brownlee. Jeffries. Buchanan.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Buck. Johnson. Bouchon. Johnson. Bazinski. Jeffries. Burchett. Johnson. Burgess. Johnson. Burleson. Johnson. Bush. Jeffries. Calvert. Johnson. Kamek. Johnson. Caraveo. Jeffries. Carbajal. Jeffries. Cardenas. Jeffries. Carey. Johnson. Carl. Johnson. Carson. Jeffries. Carter of Georgia.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Carter of Louisiana.
Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Carter of Texas. Johnson. Cartwright. Jeffries. Kassar. Jeffries. Case. Jeffries. Caston. Jeffries. Castor of Florida. Jeffries. Castro of Texas. Jeffries. Chavez de Reamer. Johnson. Sherfilis McCormick. Jeffries. Chu. Jeffries. Siscomani. Johnson. Clark of Massachusetts. Jeffries. Clark of New York. Jeffries. Cleaver. Jeffries. Klein. Johnson. Cloud. Johnson. Clyburn. Jeffries. Clyde. Johnson. Cohen. Jeffries. Cole. Johnson. Collins. Johnson. Comer. Johnson. Connolly. Jeffries. Correa. Correa. Costa. Jeffries. Courtney. Jeffries. Craig.
Happy wedding anniversary to my wife, Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Crane. Johnson. Crawford. Johnson. Crenshaw. Johnson. Crockett. Jeffries. Crow. Jeffries. Cuellar. Jeffries. Curtis. Johnson. Davis of Kansas. Jeffries. Davidson. Johnson. Davis of Illinois. Jeffries. Davis of North Carolina. Jeffries. Dean of Pennsylvania. Jeffries. DeGette. Jeffries. Dela Cruz. Johnson. DeLauro. Jeffries. Del Bene. Jeffries. DeLuzio. Jeffries. DeSaulnier. Jeffries. Desjardins. Johnson. D'Esposito. Johnson. Diaz-Balart. Johnson. Dingle. Jeffries. Doggett. Jeffries. Donalds. Johnson. Duarte. Johnson. Duncan. Johnson. Dunn of Florida.
Johnson.
Johnson. Edwards. Johnson. Elsie. Johnson. Emmer. Johnson. Escobar. Jeffries. Eshoo. Jeffries. Espaillat. Jeffries. Estes. Johnson. Evans. Jeffries. Ezell. Johnson. Fallon.
Fourth District of Texas proudly and enthusiastically vote for Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Finstra. Johnson. Ferguson. Johnson. Finstad. Johnson. Fishbach. Johnson. Fitzgerald. Johnson. Fitzpatrick. Johnson. Fleischman. Johnson. Fletcher. Jeffries. Flood. Johnson. Foster. Jeffries. Fushi. Jeffries. Fox. Johnson. Lois Frankel. Jeffries. Scott Franklin. Johnson. Frost. Jeffries. Fry. Johnson. Fulcher. Johnson. Gates. Johnson. Gallagher. Johnson. Gallego. Gallego. Garamendi. Jeffries. Garbarino. Johnson. Mike Garcia. Johnson. Robert Garcia. Jeffries. Garcia of Illinois. Jeffries. Garcia of Texas. Jeffries. Jimenez. Johnson. Golden of Maine. Jeffries. Goldman of New York. Jeffries. Gomez. Jeffries. Tony Gonzalez. Johnson. Vicente Gonzalez. Vicente Gonzalez. Good of Virginia. Johnson. Gooden of Texas. Johnson. Gosar. Johnson. Gottheimer. Jeffries. Granger. Johnson. Graves of Louisiana. Johnson. Graves of Missouri. Johnson. Green of Tennessee. Johnson. Green of Texas.
The Speaker in waiting, the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Green of Georgia. Johnson. Griffith. Johnson. Grijalva. Jeffries. Grothman. Johnson. Guest. Johnson. Guthrie. Johnson. Hageman. Johnson. Harder of California. Jeffries. Harris. Johnson. Harshbarger. Johnson. Hayes. Jeffries. Hearn. Johnson. Higgins of Louisiana. Johnson. Higgins of New York. Jeffries. Hill. Johnson. Himes. Jeffries. Henson. Johnson. Horsford.
For democracy, Hakeem
Jeffries.
Jeffries.
Houchin. Johnson. Houlihan. Jeffries. Hoyer. Jeffries. Hoyle of Oregon. Jeffries. Hudson. Johnson. Huffman. Jeffries. Huizinga. Johnson. Hunt.
Mark Johnson.
Johnson. Issa. Johnson. Ivy. Jeffries. Jackson of Illinois.
The Honorable Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Jackson of North Carolina. Jeffries. Jackson of Texas. Johnson. Jackson Lee.
The distinguished gentleman, Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Jacobs. Jeffries. James. Johnson. Jayapal. Jeffries. 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 Johnson of Georgia.
Standing for reproductive freedom for women, I cast my vote for Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Johnson of Louisiana. Johnson. Johnson of Ohio. Johnson. Johnson of South Dakota. Johnson. Jordan. Johnson. Joyce of Ohio. Joyce of Ohio. Johnson. Joyce of Pennsylvania. Johnson. Camlogger Dove. Jeffries. Captor. Jeffries. Kane of New Jersey. Johnson. Keating. Jeffries. Kelly of Illinois. Jeffries. Kelly of Mississippi. Johnson. Kelly of Pennsylvania. Johnson. Khanna. Jeffries. Kiggins of Virginia. Johnson. Kildee. Jeffries. Kiley. Johnson. Kilmer. Jeffries. Kim of California. Johnson. Kim of New Jersey. Jeffries. Krishnamurthy. Jeffries. Custer. Jeffries. Kustoff. Johnson. LaHood. Johnson. LaLota. Johnson. LaMalfa. Johnson. Lamborn. Johnson. Landsman. Landsman. Jeffries. Langworthy. Johnson. Larson of Washington. Jeffries. Larson of Connecticut. Jeffries. Latta. Johnson. LaTurner. Johnson. Lawler. Johnson. Lee of California. Jeffries. Lee of Florida. Johnson. Lee of Nevada. Jeffries. Lee of Pennsylvania. Jeffries. Ledger Fernandez. Jeffries. Lesko. Johnson. Letlow. Johnson. Levin. Jeffries. Liu. Jeffries. Lofgren. Jeffries. Loudermilk.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Lucas. Johnson. Luetkemeyer. Johnson. Luna. Johnson. Luttrell. Johnson. Lynch. Jeffries. Mace. Johnson. Magaziner. Jeffries. Maliotakis. Johnson. Mann. Johnson. Manning. Jeffries. Massey. Johnson. Mast. Johnson. Matsui. Jeffries. McBath. Jeffries. McCarthy. Johnson. McCall. Johnson. McLean. Johnson. McClellan. Jeffries. McClintock. Johnson. McCullum. Jeffries. McCormick. Johnson. McGarvey. Jeffries. McGovern. Jeffries. McHenry. Johnson. Meeks. Jeffries. Menendez. Jeffries. Ming. Jeffries. Muser. Johnson. Mfume. Jeffries. Miller of Illinois. Johnson. Miller of Ohio. Johnson. Miller of West Virginia. Johnson. Miller Meeks. Johnson. Mills.
For the Republic, Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Molinaro.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Molinar. Johnson. Mooney. Johnson. Moore of Alabama. Johnson. Moore of Utah. Johnson. Moore of Wisconsin. Jeffries. Moran. Johnson. Morelli. Jeffries. Moskowitz. Jeffries. Moulton. Jeffries. Mervan. Jeffries. Mullen. Jeffries. Murphy. Johnson. Nadler. Jeffries. Napolitano. Jeffries. Neal. Jeffries. Neguse. Jeffries. Nels. Johnson. Newhouse.
Johnson of Louisiana.
Johnson. Nickel. Jeffries. Norcross. Jeffries. Norman. Johnson. Nunn of Iowa.
Miracle Mike
Johnson. Obernolte. Johnson. Ocasio-Cortez. Jeffries. Ogles. Johnson. Omar. Jeffries. Owens. Johnson. Pallone. Jeffries. Palmer. Johnson. Panetta. Jeffries. Pappas. Jeffries. Pasquale. Jeffries. Payne.
Gentleman from New York, Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Pelosi.
As one who knows and respects the role of Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Peltola. Jeffries. Pence. Johnson. Perez. Jeffries. Perry. Johnson. Peters, Jeffries. Pedersen, Jeffries. Pfluger, Johnson. Phillips, Jeffries. Pingree, Jeffries. Pocan, Jeffries. Porter, Jeffries. Posey, Johnson. Presley, Jeffries. Quigley, Jeffries. Ramirez,
Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Raskin, Jeffries. Reschenthaler, Johnson. Rogers of Washington, Johnson. Rogers of Alabama, Johnson. Rogers of Kentucky, Johnson. Rose, Johnson. Rosendale, Johnson. Ross, Jeffries. Rouser, Johnson. Roy, Johnson. Ruiz, Jeffries. Rupersberger, Jeffries. Rutherford,
The very honorable Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Ryan, Jeffries. Salazar, Johnson. Salinas, Jeffries. Sanchez, Jeffries. Santos, Johnson. Sarbanes, Jeffries. Scalise,
Great state of Louisiana, Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Scanlon, Jeffries. Schakowsky, Jeffries. Schiff, Jeffries. Snyder, Jeffries. Skolton, Jeffries. Schreier, Jeffries. Swikert, Johnson. Austin Scott, Johnson. David Scott, Jeffries. Scott of Virginia, Jeffries. Self, Johnson. Sessions, Johnson. Sewell, Jeffries. Sherman, Jeffries. Sherrill, Jeffries. Simpson, Johnson. Slotkin, Jeffries. Smith of Missouri, Johnson. Smith of Nebraska, Johnson. Smith of New Jersey, Johnson. Smith of Washington, Jeffries. Smucker, Johnson. Sorensen, Jeffries. Soto, Jeffries. Spamberger, Jeffries. Sparts. Johnson. Stensbury. Jeffries. Stanton. Jeffries. Stauber. Johnson. Steele. Johnson. Stefanik. Johnson. Stile. Johnson. Stube. Johnson. Stevens. Jeffries. Strickland.
For the protection of voting rights, Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Strong. Johnson. Swalwell. Jeffries. Sykes. Jeffries. Takano. Jeffries. Tenney.
The Honorable Mike Johnson of Louisiana.
Johnson. Tanadar. Jeffries. Thompson of California. Jeffries. Thompson of Mississippi. Jeffries. Thompson of Pennsylvania. Johnson. Tiffany. Johnson. Timmons. Johnson. Titus. Jeffries. Tlaib. Jeffries. Takuda. Jeffries. Tonko. Jeffries. Torres of California. Jeffries. Torres of New York. Jeffries. Trahan. Jeffries. Trone. Jeffries. Turner. Johnson. Underwood. Jeffries. Valadeo. Johnson. Van Drew.
We are back better than ever. Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Van Dyne. Johnson. Van Orden. Van Orden. Vargas. Jeffries. Vasquez. Jeffries. Vesey. Jeffries. Velasquez. Jeffries. Wagner. Johnson. Wahlberg. Johnson. Waltz. Johnson. Wasserman Schultz. Jeffries. Waters.
He supports freedom of choice. Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Watson Coleman.
As the only candidate who represents the integrity of this House,
Watson Coleman.
do I need to say Hakeem Jeffries again because I read?
Jeffries.
The House will come to order. The clerk, the staff, and the tellers deserve to have the attention of the House. The clerk will continue.
Weber of Texas. Johnson. Webster of Florida. Johnson. Winstrup. Johnson. Westerman. Johnson. Wexton. Jeffries. Wild. Jeffries. Williams of Georgia.
Fulton County, Georgia, votes for Hakeem Jeffries.
Jeffries. Williams of New York.
The son of a firefighter, Mike
Johnson.
Johnson.
Williams of Texas.
Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Wilson of Florida. Wilson of Florida. Jeffries. Wilson of South Carolina. Johnson. Whitman. Johnson. Womack.
With the 217th pick in the race for Speaker, the 3rd District of Arkansas selects Mike Johnson.
Johnson. Yacom. Johnson. Zinke.
The next Speaker of the People's House, Mike Johnson.
Johnson.
The clerk will now call the names of the members who did not answer the first call of the roll.
Beyer. Jeffries. Who do you have? Boyle of Pennsylvania. Boyle of Pennsylvania. Correa. Correa. Gallego. Jeffries. Vicente Gonzalez. Vicente Gonzalez. Van Orden. Van Orden.
If there are any members who did not answer the call of the roll, they may come to the well and vote at this time. in their tallies that the total number of votes cast is 429, of which the Honorable Mike Johnson of the state of Louisiana has received 220 votes. And the Honorable Hakeem Jeffries of the state of New York has received 209 votes. Therefore, the Honorable Mike Johnson of the state of Louisiana, having received a majority of the votes cast, is duly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives for the 118th Congress. The chair appoints the following committee to escort the Speaker-elect to the chair: the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise; the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer; the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Stefanik; the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson; the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer; the gentlewoman from Michigan, Mrs. McLean; the gentleman from California, Mr. McCarthy; the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds; the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn; the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bergman; the gentlewoman from Washington, Mrs. Rogers; the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington; the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon; the gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro; the gentlewoman from Florida, Mrs. Carmack; the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries; the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Clark; the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar; the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu; the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Delbene; the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn; the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse; the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Escobar; the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Underwood; the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz; the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee; the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Jacobs; the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett; and the members of the Louisiana delegation, Mr. Graves, Mr. Higgins, Ms. Letlow, Mr. Carter. The committee will retire from the chamber to escort the Speaker-elect to the chair.